Welcome back to our course on PSE 15. In this section we're going to take a look at preferences, and if you've used an earlier and relatively recent version of PSE you can probably skip this section. For those of you who don't know about preferences, preferences are basically a way of personalizing your installation of PSE to suit the way that you're going to use it. Many of the preferences won't really mean much to you early on, and we'll need to come back to them later on in the course. But there are quite a few that you need to be aware of before you start, and particularly before you start capturing and storing images. And in this section we're going to look at some of the preferences that you need to check and potentially change early on. There are preferences for both the editor and the organizer, and we're going to start with the editor. You access the preferences from the edit menu down at the bottom, preferences. There is a list, and these represent the pages of preferences. If you click on the top entry, general, note the shortcut there, Control K, it opens up the preferences dialog. And these are the pages of preferences. There are quite a few of them, and if you take something like display and cursors for example, this probably doesn't mean much to you at the moment, but it gives you a way of setting your standards for painting cursors, other cursors, the cropping tool and so on. So we're going to need to come back to these later on in the course. But what I'd like to do first is to give you a demonstration of one of the preferences on the general page. It'll give you a good idea of what preferences are all about. Now this isn't one that you really need to set earlier on. In fact, it's quite likely you'll want to change it later on. But it is a particularly easy one to demonstrate and understand. On this general page, there's an option here, Show Tooltips, which is currently checked. And notice when I hover over Show Tooltips, a little panel comes up that determines whether to show, etc. That is a tooltip. Now it's currently checked. I'm going to cancel the preferences. I'm going to go over to one of the tools, say this one that looks like an eye over here, hover over it, and there's the tooltip, Red Eye Removal Tool. Now let me click on Edit, go back into the general preferences again. What I'm going to do is uncheck Show Tooltips. Make sure I click on OK rather than cancel. Now if I hover over that eye again, I don't get a tooltip. So that's a very straightforward example of a preference. Let me just set the tooltips back on again. Note that if I was part way through making changes and I wanted to put them back to where they were, there's a reset button. And also on the right here there's a next and previous pair of buttons that will take me through the pages of the preferences. Back on the general page, right at the bottom there are three important buttons. The bottom one, Reset Auto Smart Tone Learning, I'm going to come back to later, but the other two you need to know about now really. The first one, Reset Preferences on Next Launch. What will happen if I click that is that the next time I start the editor, my preferences will be reset to their default values. The second button, Reset All Warning Dialogues, takes a little longer to explain. At various places in PSE, when you are about to do something, you try to do something, you'll get a warning. And after you've had that warning a couple of times, you may get a bit annoyed by it and think, I know what I'm doing, I don't need that warning. And you often have the opportunity to switch the warning off. And you'll see that happening during the course. If having switched off one or more warnings, you'd like to start seeing them all again. So for instance, if somebody new is going to start using your installation of PSE and you want them to start seeing the warnings again, if you click that button, you'll reset all the warning dialogues so that they start to appear again. Now what I said earlier on is that I'm going to show you the things that you need to check straight away. And the first of those things are on the Units and Rulers page of preferences. The top section, Units. If you're in the US, you may well want to use primarily what we call imperial units, inches and so on. And the settings that I'm using are indeed the ones that probably most people in the US will use. If you would prefer to use metric units, and many people in Europe and the UK would prefer to use metric units, you can change, for example, your ruler from inches to centimeters or millimeters or any of these other available settings. If you don't know what picas are, they're a printing measure. If you don't know what they are, I suggest you avoid trying to use them. So first of all, make sure that these 4 settings are set the way that you want to use them. If you don't have a reason to change type from points, I would leave it set at points. But the other 3 you probably want to set either as inches or in one of the metric units. What you have these set at does not change what you can do in PSE. It doesn't mean that some features work and other features don't work. But when we do things like display rulers and actually measure the size of images and so on, if you set these the way that you're used to, you'll find performing those operations much easier. While we're looking at editor preferences, there's just one other that I want you to check, and that is if you go to the Update Options page, you have a choice of automatically download and install updates or notify me when an update is available, and you can see that I have the latter option set. One of the reasons that I do that is that on this particular installation I wouldn't really want an update, a new version of PSE 15 to appear when I was halfway through recording a section, because it may involve changing functionality such as fixing a bug. But generally speaking, if you have the first option there selected, automatically download and install updates, that will make sure that your installation of PSE 15 is kept up to date. I know that some people really like things to be automatic, and some people like to know what's going on and to be able to control when the installation of updates actually occurs. So this is very much a personal preference, but get it set the way that you want it set. They're the ones you need to think about in the editor. Let's go into the organizer now and look at the preferences there. So I'm now in the organizer. You access the preferences in the same way. So it's Edit Preferences. Once again, they're arranged into pages. We're going to start with the general page, and again there are a few important settings on the general page. And starting at the top under Display Options, we're looking here at print sizes, and this will be for things like the size of pages that you want to print onto. I'm going to leave mine set at inches, but you have a choice of metric units instead. And now a couple of options which you maybe want to think carefully about now, but particularly the first one you may not really be in a position to make a long-term judgment about until you've been using the organizer for a while. When you're looking at the images taken on a certain day, this pair of radio buttons here, Show Oldest, Show Newest, determines whether you see the oldest images first or the newest ones first when you look at the display in the organizer. You may want to make a decision about that now, or you may want to leave it for the moment. You also have the option of how you want the date format to appear. The default is the US format, month, day, year. Second option, day, month, year, is the option that's used generally in Europe and the UK. And then you also have the alternative of turning the second one round and having year, month, day. A little bit further down, reset all warning dialogues. That's the warning dialogues for the organizer. I explained that to you in relation to the editor. And you also have a button at the bottom, restore default settings. That's for the organizer preferences as well. The other page of preferences that you need to be aware of here is camera or card reader. Near the top there is a setting, save files in, and then there is the name of a folder, and this is set to a default. In the case of Windows it will be my users Toby A, that's me, pictures folder. This is where by default any images that I save are going to be stored. Now if you want to change that location, there's a browse button on the right and you can browse. You can find a folder on your device and use that as the default folder for saving any images. You may want to change that now, but I suggest that you find out a little bit more about the organizer and catalogs before you do that. Any files that you save in the meantime while you're finding out about these things can be moved pretty easily later on, and I will show you how to do that. The other very important setting on this page is near the bottom, delete options, and it's currently set to after copying do not delete originals, and that's generally how I have things set. If I'm copying images from a device, once I've copied them, I don't immediately delete them. I normally keep the originals and will either back them up somewhere else or maybe just leave them on the card. I find nowadays that the cost of storage cards, SD cards and so on, is so low that I can keep images for a very long time. And also copying them to high capacity storage devices is a good way of doing a backup. If you really don't want that setting, the alternatives include after copying delete originals, which speaks for itself, and after copying verify and delete originals. What happens in that case is that once the images have been copied, PSE makes sure that the copies are an exact copy of the originals and then deletes the originals. I suggest you leave this set at this default setting for now, unless you've got a good reason not to. And in fact, with all of these camera or card reader settings, I suggest that once you've done a little bit of work with PSE, you've captured some images, started to use the organizer, you come back to this page and revisit those options that I've mentioned. And of course, I'll be covering most of the other options on this page as we go through the course as well. So you're certain to be back here from time to time, and that's an opportunity to review the way that you have these preferences set. That's it on preferences for the moment. I'll see you in the next section.